Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today we're not just joined by one guest, by two guests today. I love these because it keeps me even more on my toes. Right, I'm trying to figure out how we make distill the wisdom of two fantastic guests today. So Stephanie and Paula, welcome to the show. Thank you for making time to come on and share your stuff with us today.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So maybe we could start with Stephanie. Could you introduce yourself to the listeners? Then we'll do the same with Paula.
Sure. My name is Stephanie Sterling, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I work in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I work for Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Baton Rouge. And I'm the director of family services here. And I've been here at Catholic Charities for about 10 years.
Brilliant. And you, Paula, if you could do the same, please.
Sure. My name is Paula Davis. I too am a licensed clinical social worker. I currently work at the Louisiana State University School of Social Work, but most of my experience has been in adoption, working with all members of the adoption constellation. So birth parents, adopted people, and adopted parents.
Yeah. So what comes to your mind when you hear this phrase, Thriving Adoptees, the name of the show?
What comes to my mind is information. And sometimes the information is difficult, maybe history or birth history. It might be difficult information or hard to hear, but it seems to me that adoptees or adopted persons thrive with more information about their history, about where they come from, even if it's difficult information.
Yeah. And what's your take on that, Paula?
I think I would echo what Stephanie said. There's a documentary called Adopted for the Life of Me by Jean Strauss. I don't know if you've seen it, but she follows the story of several adult adopted people who search for their birth families. And at the very end of the documentary, she says, even a small child can tell you that living things need light to survive. And that, I think, what Stephanie was talking about, information, whether it's adopted people, whether it's birth parents, or whether it's adoptive parents, everybody does better with information. So making sure that when you're working with an adoptive couple who's looking to adopt, that they're prepared for this lifelong journey of adoption, making sure that they understand that adoption adds another layer of complexity to parenting, and making sure that women who make that selfless decision of adoption have access to information as well.
Yeah. And did you say need light to survive?
Need light to survive. That's correct.
Yeah.
And
what do you mean by light?
That nothing grows in the dark. Nothing grows in secrecy.
Yeah. So the old analogy is that mushrooms here, isn't it? That's something to. I can't. What do you remember that? What that is? I can't. It's something like mushrooms. Mushrooms are the only things that grow in the dark. Is that something like this? The story, yeah. So why do we need information to? Why do we need information to thrive? What's that about?
I think everybody wants to know where they come from. They want to know who they look like. They want to know their history. People have this innate, emotion or desire to know more about themselves. And when we don't have information, then we make things up. So it could be, a fantasy. It could be a good fantasy, or it could be, it could be a positive fantasy, or it could be a negative fantasy. But whatever it is, it's not based in fact, it's based in our imaginations, or maybe bits and pieces of what we've been told, but maybe not the whole story.
Yeah.
And when we base our identity on bits and pieces or on fantasy, it's never the reality of who we truly are. So, we've learned over the years in working with adopted persons that, they may have based their whole identity on something that wasn't true, or maybe they were told something that wasn't true. And they have to really rethink their whole life at that point, because they had based their entire life on something that was false, or something they made up, or something someone else made up about their history.
Yeah.
And that can be really devastating.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I'll add to, in working with adult adopted people who search for their birth families, one of the things that they say to me is, I feel like my life is like a puzzle with a lot of pieces missing. So how do you as a human being feel whole? How do you thrive when large portions of your story are not there? And one of the things that I've also seen in working with adults who've had reunion with birth families is having information about their whole story, whether it's positive or negative. And usually it's a combination of both, as is true for everybody. We all have positive sides of our story, and we also have difficult information in our story. But it tends to improve all of their relationships around them, because when you think about your identity, it's hard to connect to others if large pieces of who you are missing. And so I would add that it's important that information is shared in an empathetic, loving, age-appropriate way, so that adult adopted people can thrive.
Yeah. So I was talking to, so I'm in my 50s, right? I was talking to an adopted guy who's about my age, right? From the States. And he'd been on this quest. He'd been on this quest to find the truth. And he seemed to me, he said to me, like, I've resolved everything. I've got to the end, and he felt that he was there. He felt whole. And it was really interesting, because he didn't seem that whole to me. Do you know what I mean? So he'd found the missing pieces, but he was still struggling a bit. So the thing that's coming to my mind is this kind of expectation, the expectation effect. So we've got people that on one end of the continuum, people are consumed with the need to know, and at the other end of the spectrum, we've got a kind of, I'm not really bothered. I'm not really bothered about the past. And I'm just wondering, what does that continuum look like? Is it one of those like bell curve things where some are at the extremes and then the majority in the middle, or because we're all somewhere on that? It's not a one or a no. It's not a binary thing, is it?
Right.
This curiosity. What does it look like?
So one thing that I would say is that I think it's very true that there are some people who are consumed with the need to know, and maybe some other people who are not. Again, that is human nature. There are some people who are very curious, whether they're adopted or not, and some people who just sort of accept life as it is. So I think that would just fall within whatever is in typical society. But I will also say that for people who are adopted, there are milestones that maybe bring up adoption for them. So they may be thinking about it more. For an adult adopted person who was adopted in a closed adoption, a lot of times what I hear is when they have children themselves, that it hits them, that this is the first time in their lives where they've looked at somebody and see their features reflected back. Another thing that I've noticed in my work with people who are searching, men tend to search later than women. And usually it's men in their late 40s, early 50s. So it's kind of like I've raised my family. My kids are grown. Maybe my adoptive parents are deceased. So I don't feel this loyalty to them anymore. So I can search. But it's almost like now that all these other things in my life have been taken care of, I can focus on this one aspect. And, one of the saddest things, everybody thinks adoption is happy work. And one of the saddest things to me happened several years ago. It was a hospice social worker called me and she said, I'm working with a woman who is in her 90s, who is dying, and she was adopted, and she wants information about her birth history. Can you help? And I couldn't help because she was not adopted through our agency. But for this woman who was dying to be able to go and die peacefully, she needed access to her history. And we could not provide that for her. That was really difficult.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting you say about the men searching later and when their adoptive parents have perhaps died. Because my experience was like I was sitting in a therapist chair, and the thought of my birth mother rejecting me again as I saw it, right, came into my head, and I got very scared at that, and then I got very determined that fear wasn't going to ruin my life, or not ruin my life. We're talking. I'm over dramatizing.
Mm-hmm.
I decided that fear wasn't going to affect me, and so I did what I believe that your Marines do. I ran towards the gunfire. The Marines say, I've said this before on some of the podcasts. Apologize, listeners, if you've heard me say this before, but some of you might not. So the Marines apparently run towards the gunfire, and they say that every other part of the US military runs away from the gunfire. That's their view on it. So I ran towards the gunfire, and so I was coming from quite a we would say Bolshevik, like that comes from some Russian for Bolshevik, quite a grumpy place to resume my birth search, research my birth mother, and that led me to discovering some stuff, and I the putting the missing pieces in the puzzle. That's how I did it. I'm just wondering, what do you talked about? I think it was you, Stephanie. You talked about it being in fact, like just the facts, right? Coming at this from facts, because otherwise we've got this fantasy, and you know the fantasy could be the kind of the rainbows and unicorns, or it could be a fantasy of the nightmare variety, and mine was more in the nightmare variety. And there's this tendency that we have as adoptees to make stuff up. I mean, as I think human beings, we all kind of make stuff up. And one of the things that we make up is that once we've got to the end of this search, then we'll be whole. Just I mean that the missing pieces will make us whole. The fact that we're not whole already. What does that look like? What does it look like? How accurate are adoptees in I'm struggling to find the right word here. How good? Yeah, forecasting. How good are adoptees at forecasting how they're going to feel when they've got the missing pieces? Is that a toughie?
I think people, once you have the missing pieces, I think it's then time to do the processing, because
okay.
And especially with someone who is an adoption competent therapist, because that's an important piece to have that, education that goes beyond. It's more of a specialization. And I would say it's important for folks who, when they get that information or they are using an adoption competent therapist in order to obtain information, would be, best case, because then that professional can help them process their feelings, because they're going to have feelings about their history, their past, why they were placed for adoption, if that information is then realized or obtained. And it would be really helpful for somebody that understands the complexities of adoption to help them process those feelings related to that information, and then also process their grief of, even the grief of their who they thought they were, of losing a piece of maybe what they thought their history was, and their identity based on that. It's, processing the grief and loss again, now that more information has been obtained.
And I would like to add to that, too, the importance of not only processing after, but the importance of processing before. So a good adoption competent therapist helps someone do the processing before the search begins. And one of the things that I'm a part of right now is the training for adoption competence. That is a training that's here in the US through the Center for Adoption Support and Education, that the goal is to make sure that therapists are trained in adoption competence, because many times adult adopted people, members of the adoption constellation, seek mental health, and that person doesn't even touch on adoption, or if they do, they're touching on adoption, but it's founded by myth. And earlier we talked about the importance of information. So if I'm working with someone and they reach out to me, so let's say it's a man your age, Simon, and they're asking about information, one of the things that I talk to them about is that their birth mother probably did not have a choice about the adoption. Like, this was a decision that was made for her. She had no say. The other thing that I tell them is, even if she has not started to search for you, it's probably because in the US, she was told that it was against the law for her to search for you. Like, that information, I think, is important for an adult adopted person to know, because sometimes they're telling themselves, she's not searching for me because she didn't care. She made an adoption plan because she did not care. And that couldn't be further from the truth. It could be the adults in her life stepped in and said, you cannot do this. Or if you do this, you're going to do it without any support. And then the professionals involved said, go on, do not ever speak of this again, and don't even think about trying to contact your child because it's against the law. Now, that's not true, but that's what they were told. And to provide that information to an adult person and see them start to process that is very important. And then the other part, like Stephanie said, is then you follow up on the tail end of providing support for what comes out of this search, whether it's this unicorns and rainbows story, or whether it's not unicorns and rainbows.
Yeah. Wow. This is really powerful stuff. Because first off, I address what Stephanie said, is that it's almost as if, so what shifted for me is that, or maybe it's just the way I'm hearing it, that the finding this information is kind of the end of the road, and it's at the end of the journey, and it's not. It's a milestone along the journey, and it's the starting point of a different sort of the journey, and that to me is it's one of those. It's one of those. That's really obvious, Simon. Why hadn't you thought of it like that before? Moments, you know. And it's also incredibly validating for me on what I've been doing, right, and my own journey, and then the kind of like the lovely bombshells that Paula's dropping with is like two critical points of information. It is all about information, but it may not be about the information about the birth mother, where she lived, but the piece of information that she was probably coerced, you know, or it wasn't her choice, or it wasn't. Older people, probably older people with more power, people with more authority over her, had been in the driving seat, and she wasn't. So it wasn't as if she didn't have that free choice. So that story that somebody might be making up, that well, I've talked about my own story, right? So when I had this meltdown about my birth mother at 40, it was my birth mother didn't love me enough to keep me, and she gave me this. She gave me away, and she gave me this consolation prize. That's not a consolation for the fact that she gave me away. And essentially, that was the kind of the stuff that was. Those were the words that came out of my mouth, and I'd never had those thoughts before. You know, they had never been at the back of my brain. I'd never thought anything like. I'd never given her a second thought, really, for birth mother. I'd never borne any malice to her before that, and I'd never really thought about it. But then this came up, and when it came up, it was, well, this is the danger of the stories that we make up in our heads. And we think, I heard this from somebody in the US a few months ago, and I love that. We think that the voice in our heads is CNN, when really it's the Comedy Channel. It's a work of fiction. And the thing is that all of us, human beings, adopted or non-adopted, we're so kind of consumed by the drama in our heads that we sometimes struggle to distinguish between what is true and what is, to use a technical term, baloney. And that's where the the facts become priceless, because we're no longer laboring under a whole set of false misunderstandings. And yeah.
Well, Simon, you talked about why did this not hit you before? And I would say probably because you weren't ready for it. And that again speaks to the part of this being a journey. But the other thing, so we talked about women who made adoption plans and closed adoptions, but women who make adoption plans now, where they are, in some ways, they have choice. One of the things that I think is really important to know, and I've been working in adoption for 20 plus years, I have never, ever met a mother who did not love her child. Now, there may be some things that get in the way of her showing that love. It could be poverty. It could be substance use. It could be mental illness, but I have never, ever met a mother who didn't love her child. And the women that we work with who make adoption plans, number one, they're usually a little bit older. So it's not the high school girl who got in trouble anymore. It is somebody who's probably 25 to 35. And they're already parenting other children. And typically they are excellent parents. And so when you think about that, I cannot think of a more significant example of a mother's love than a woman putting her child's needs above her own and making this adoption plan. And that is something that society typically doesn't talk about. But the women that we work with, this is not an easy decision. There is a lot of thought, a lot of effort, a lot of planning that goes into it, a lot of work, a lot of pain. And to leave someone in the hospital and take their baby with you is probably some of the hardest work that I have ever done in my life, because I feel like I'm kidnapping someone's child and I see the devastation that I'm leaving behind. And then for adoptive parents, when it's an open relationship and they're there on that day and they're leaving with the baby, to see the greatest source of their joy come from the depths of someone they care about's despair, that's adoption. That is adoption. And it's important that the professionals involved understand that, get that, and that they educate others about the realities of adoption rather than the myths that drive it.
Yeah.
And it's important, thank you, Paula, because I think what you just said is so profound. I think it's also important that the professionals are there to support the adoptive parents and the birth families so that they can move through and, process this journey, because like Paula said, one person's greatest joy is born out of someone else's greatest loss. And it is very difficult to hold that reality in your mind at the same time. And the adoptive, in open relationships, the adoptive families are witness to the birth families' grief and loss. And it's very difficult. It can be very difficult for them. And it's important that the adoption professionals are there to help support them through that, the adoptive families and the birth families, because it's, one of the most difficult walks that I've walked with someone else is, someone who's placing their child for adoption.
Yeah. Is that loss lessened in any way from the birth for the birth parent, for the birth mom, when there's going to be openness and relationship going forward?
I think it helps, but that loss is always there. And it's important too to remember that, as Stephanie said, birth parents need support, because in some ways I've had birth mothers say connection is like reopening a wound over and over again. But the other thing about openness is that when they have appropriate support, they can heal. And not only is there loss in adoption, but there is also some joy. Whereas if there's no openness, it's just the loss. But I don't want people to think that openness is a panacea for the loss. It's not. The loss is still there.
I was trying to ask it in a gentle way, you know, is there a sense of that? And I guess there's a complexity to this that is perhaps beyond words or beyond the rational. And I listen to a lot of other podcasts. I don't listen to many podcasts in the adoption space actually, but other podcasts about, let's call it mindset for want of a better word, and it is always it is always about mindset. It's always mental health. It's always about psychology, and it's less about emotions. Do you see what I mean? So everybody, so I listen to lots of kind of sports performance podcasts, and everybody's trying to reduce it. Everybody's trying to reduce it to kind of thought stuff rather than emotional stuff. So it makes a rational, logical sense, and you know, X and Y. It's very deterministic. It's very mechanistic. It's very reductionistic, and that we're not talking about anything like that here. And it always seems to, often it seems to flip to me, to reduce it to thoughts. And so I was trying to ask that question in a sensitive way. Does it lessen? Does it lessen? But the world wants us to say 1 or 0, doesn't it? And you know, we're feeling beings, not thinking beings. Nobody ever wanted to think good, did they? This is one of my mentors said. Nobody wants to think good. We want to feel good. We're
Right.
about the feelings. We're about our feelings. So it's funny, isn't it? Everybody's obsessed with mental health, but we don't talk quite as much about emotional well-being. That's seen as kind of
and you can't have mental health without emotional well-being. Like, do you know what I'm saying? You can't have one without the other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I see. For me, the answer lies above both of those things. You know, the kind of most of us, I thought it was just the Brits that are obsessed with the weather, right? But I've been to the States quite a lot, and I've been to events where lots of people from different parts of the States have got together, and obviously you've got a bigger country than we have, so the differences in your weather are more extreme than the differences here in the UK. So you love this stuff, but we've got this thing in the UK called miserable weather. Have you got that stuff? Right? Miserable weather. There's this idea, this societal belief that the weather can determine our mood, you know? And it doesn't really bear any scrutiny, but we all believe it, right? We all kind of believe it. But the truth is that our feelings always come from our thoughts. So yes, mental health, you could say mental health, what's going on in our heads determines what's going on in our hearts, our emotional well-being. You could kind of determine it that way. But most of us haven't even got that far because we still think it's the weather that's causing how we feel.
Well, and so what I was saying is, I think you need the emotional well-being in order to have mental health. The other, like the opposite way. But I will also say that there is some proof that the weather does impact our mood. Like,
well, if we think it does,
no, well, no,
think it does, it does.
No, well, that's true too. That, I mean, like that is true too. But also, in places where there's no sunshine for long periods of time, people have trouble with sleep. I mean, like it does impact us, whether we want to believe it or not, because when you think about it, at our core, we are primates, we are animals, you know, and so a lot of stuff that we have is hardwired into us.
Yeah, I was going to say something jokey then, but
I know that's okay. You don't. I mean, but when you think about it, we are.
I know better than this.
Well, and
I'm joking. Right?
I know. But think about too. I think adoption also is influenced by the fact that we are primates, because when you talk about attachment, the ways that we attach are hardwired into us by our old part of our brain, like the primal primate part of our brain. That's all hardwired into us. And so making sure that families that are adopting understand the realities of what this child has faced prenatally because of what they've been exposed to. So yeah. So,
I'm
well,
with you.
You know, yeah.
I'm with you. And I think probably hardwiring it gets underestimated, especially by people trying to sell us mindset courses, because they tell us that we can overcome, we can. I put a post out about this last week actually. So a lot of people will talk about rewiring the brain. So you think this way, so you need to think differently. And if you just spend X dollars or X pounds and X hours with me, then I'll show you how to rewire the brain. And then so you've got that sort of thing, but that doesn't tend to work. Well, it didn't work for me anyway. And then you go for the dewiring. So you're dewiring, so you're trying to see through all your limiting self-beliefs. That's another one. And then and that didn't work for me either. And then you've got the kind of, well, our thoughts and feelings don't really matter. It's because they're not who we are, and we're giving too much attention to them, and we're getting caught too much in the drama. So we're, seeing that we're not the drama, we're the screen on which the drama appears. That's kind of where I'm at the moment. So I'm not sucked in. I'm sucked into the story less. Just what I mean. I'm sucked into the drama less. So before we started recording, one of you is talking about I haven't watched the news. I think for 17 years. That was you, Stephanie, wasn't it? So you're not drawn into the drama. We were talking about the way that the news has, pulls us in with these shock headlines, scares the bejesus out of us. So I shouldn't say that with Catholic Charities press. It scares us, but we're drawn in. We're drawn into the drama. And what if when we're drawn into this drama, the story in our head, which is made up, it's not the truth, and nor is it who we are. We aren't our story. Who would we be without our story? Who would we be without our drama? And that's, for me, the identity piece. But I realized that where I'm kind of a little bit far out on this stuff. So I'm just going to check in and whether that's making any sense or I'm just losing.
And so what I would say to that, Simon, is we aren't our story, but especially as adults, we have the power to rewrite our story. And I think that goes back to the idea of journey, and that how we are constantly rewriting our story.
Yeah. Are we rewriting our story, or are we rewriting our future? Or are we doing both?
Both.
Yeah.
I think by rewriting our story, we rewrite our future.
Tell me more. I'm intrigued. You've got me curious.
Okay. All right. So earlier I mentioned the documentary Adopted for the Life of Me. And in that documentary, there's a man who searches for his birth mother. He finds out that she's deceased, but he finds out the reasons that he was placed for adoption. And part of it was because his mother was involved in an abusive relationship. And she had made that adoption plan in order to protect him. And you watch him rewrite his history on the way home after meeting with friends of hers, finding out that she had thought about him all of his life, that she'd never forgotten. And even though she hadn't told people about him, like she'd written poems, and just, he was always in the forefront of her mind, even though she never spoke to others about it. You watch him rewrite his history with this new information, that this was not a decision because she was careless. This was a decision because she was protecting him. And, you know, you have to wonder, what does his future look like now that his history has been rewritten with factual information? And in the documentary, he's divorced. He has an adult daughter. I have to believe that those relationships improved because of the information he had about his history. And I wonder, would his daughter's life be different with this new history? I wonder if he would still be divorced with this new information. We don't know, but what we do know is that he has the opportunity to rewrite his future. And we are not, our future is not predetermined.
Yeah. I'm glad I asked you the question, because I did have I had misunderstood what you said, and I wholeheartedly agree with what you just said, and I think, yeah, for sure. It's kind of similar to my own story to a degree. I remember reading one letter in the adoption file that I got, and a letter from my birth mother about did I tell you about this? A letter about the teddy bear?
No.
Oh, you did tell us she had left a teddy bear, but I don't know that you told us she left you a letter.
All right, yeah. So no, she didn't leave me a letter.
Okay.
She didn't leave me a letter. There was a letter in the file to the adoption professional thanking the adoption professional for the help on the day that she had relinquished me or handed me over to my mum and dad, or however you want to say it. Yeah, I'm not hung up on the wording, the phraseology for that. So she starts by thanking the adoption professional, and then she goes on to say that she'd meant to buy a teddy bear for me, but on the way to the meeting 4 days before, when she'd handed me over, and that the traffic was bad, so she couldn't actually stop. Would my parents accept a teddy bear from her if she was to buy it? And as I read this, I sensed her desperation. I felt her love for me. I felt her care for me 48 years before. And I realized that the story in my head was a work of fiction. And huge deluge of hot tears flooded down my face because I saw the truth. And I felt for her. And I also realized how wrong I'd been. And that is, yeah, that's kind of what you're saying, you know, rewriting the past in shorthand, in 2 words, rewriting the past, and how that would change my future going forward. So yeah, that's superb, and that's been there've been lots of significant moments on the learning journey that I've been through on the last 15 years. But that's got to be one of the most profound healing moments that I've found. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think that's important, that in order to humanize the other parties, it's, you know, we have to help adoptive families empathize with and walk in the shoes of the birth families for a bit. Because one of the myths of adoption is, you know, let's get this baby away from these people. And that's, like Paula said earlier, that's not our experience, that that birth families are, you know, bad parents or anything like that. That's not our experience. They're actually really good parents who are putting the needs of their child above their own. And for the adoptive family to walk in their shoes, in the birth family's shoes a little bit, and empathize with them, it humanizes them and also helps them to see things from the birth family perspective. And openness does help with that, because they get to know each other, they get to form a relationship, and they truly care and love for each other. And they put their child's needs above their own. The adoptive families as well puts their child's needs above their own, in recognizing that, you know, it's a good thing for the child to have more people that love them in their lives. And always, you know, in moderating that with what really, you know, what is in the best interest of the child. And but it's important to just recognize that in all relationships. And how do we do, you might not be comfortable at first, but if we put our child's needs above our own, then it most of the time is fruitful and best, you know, for all involved.
And I think one of the things that Stephanie said that to me really stands out is to make sure that adoptive parents are equipped to share their child's story, and not just what the parents couldn't provide, like what birth parents couldn't provide, but also what their strengths were. Because how do you feel good about yourself if you think you came from someplace bad? And I think, especially in the past, when adoptive parents were sharing the story, they often shared the birth parent story from a place of deficit. And certainly if things were going well, an adoption plan would not be happening. But there's also strengths that can be focused on in that moment. And like you said, how that teddy bear for you was the epitome of the care and concern and the thought that your birth mother had given, and the love that she had for you when she made that plan.
Yeah. I loved what you said, Stephanie, about humanizing it and humanizing them, and that what I was thinking is like they aren't just good parents, they're good people, to get to the heart of the matter.
Right.
So this has been a standout. This has been a standout episode for me in terms of the depth and what I've got out of it, and how it shifted some perspectives for me. So I hope it does the same for the listeners. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we close this one off?
Well, I think one last thing I would say is that we need to prepare all families for openness, because with DNA and those mechanisms that people can use on their own to find birth families, that if we don't prepare families for openness and help them along that journey, we're doing families an injustice. So it's really important that, people say that they want closed or this or that, and that's just not a reality. It's not in the best interest of anyone, and it's just not a reality in today's society.
And I would say, Simon, thank you so much for having us and giving us the opportunity to talk about something that we're all very passionate about. And my closing thought would be that adoption is a journey, and that journey never ends. And for people to be open and aware of that.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Paula, Stephanie. As always, listeners, I always put some links in so you can check out what the guests are doing in their websites and their socials. So check out what Stephanie and Paula are doing, and we will speak to you again very soon. Thanks a lot, listeners, and goodbye.